Well, ladies and gentlemen, if there has ever been a better context setter for our next topic, I've yet to see one. You know, what a wonderful panel that was. And would you believe that the title of our next presentation is actually Beyond Targets for Meaningful Decarbonisation? What a wonderful follow-on. It's a great pleasure to welcome to the stage from Mott MacDonald, Lisa Terry. Please come and join us on the stage. Thank you so much.
Hi everyone, thank you so much for the introduction. My name is Lisa Terry and I am a Senior Manager for Sustainability and Climate Change Services for Mott MacDonald, and I'm also leading the COP28 efforts for the whole company. Why am I staying here today and talking to everyone about decarbonisation? The world increasingly demands to set decarbonisation targets. It was mentioned in the panel earlier. We have legislation on an international level demanding the 1.5 degree threshold, and it needs to be met. Why does it need to be met? Realistically speaking, if we don't meet the 1.5 degree threshold, it is the end of livelihoods for small island states, least developed countries, developing countries, but on a more realistic note for you and I, it is also an extremely good reminder that if we don't keep to this 1.5 degree threshold, our futures are going to change because extreme climate events will hit us harder. The world as we know it will change. It's often referred to that we're the last generation to change things. And I hope with the insights of this presentation, I give some practical tips on how we can move beyond that target setting exercise to a more meaningful decarbonisation approach. It was also mentioned in the panel before, so it was an extremely good introduction for this presentation now, that we need a systems approach. Decarbonisation is just one piece of a puzzle. We know no matter what we do now, if we keep in the 1.5 degree threshold as mandated by the Paris Agreement or not, our climate will change. So building climate resilience needs to go hand in hand. It can't just be a decarbonisation and like we're reaching net zero, we are going to be carbon neutral. It needs to go hand in hand with risk management and our approach to resilience. Something else we need to acknowledge is that every organization is different. The capital delivery process of every organization looks different. The resources available for any organization look very different as well. So it's really around having these practical solutions on how to get to our target, our net zero, our carbon neutral target. And something which is left out a lot is our decarbonisation efforts underpinning sustainable development? If we're talking about clean solutions like nuclear, is that really safeguarding sustainable development, or is that really just a short-term thinking? How can we achieve with the decarbonisation efforts inter- and intra-generational equity as it's demanded by the sustainability definition all the way back from the Brundtland Commission? So when we talk about decarbonisation, I want you all to keep in mind that we talk about a systems approach we need. We talk about an integration, and we want to meet the triple bottom line, driving social, economic, and environmental outcomes. Let's dive into the drivers and the demands. And broadly, I captured them in three categories, and I'm pretty sure you know some of them. So the first point is really about transitional climate change risks. So global commitments, as I already mentioned, to decarbonize are getting louder and louder, and we are exposed to increased emission regulation legislation. The risk of non-compliance to these legislation is what we call transitional climate change risk. That non-compliance might include reputational harm, reduced market eligibility, or loss of access to capital. Transitional climate change risks are emerging more and more, and especially with the ratification of the Paris Agreement, we saw the landscape changing very fast. Countries are setting decarbonization efforts in NDCs. It's called National Determined Contribution, and it needs to be updated in a minimum of every 5 years. Especially after COP26 in Glasgow, we saw that the landscape is changing rapidly. On the map here, you see that currently we even have 130 countries with net zero or carbon neutrality goals. The pressure, as already mentioned in the panel earlier, to reach net zero is immense. But what also needs to be said is that actually, on a mandatory level, that cascading down from a governmental level has not happened. We have all these amazing claims around reaching net zero in 2030, 2050, 2060, just that there's a target there. But what is the roadmap to that? Countries who are a bit more in forefront, like Germany or the UK, making big strides to have that implementation roadmap formalized, but by no means we're anywhere close to where we need to be. A really interesting initiative by the European Union is called CBAM and was actually launched Tuesday last week. CBAM, the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism. What does that mean? The European Union is now putting a cost on carbon for products with a high embodied carbon value. That means if I'm an aluminium producer outside of the EU and I want to import my products, then that might put me out of business if I don't acknowledge that I have a role to play in the reduction of my embodied carbon for my products. And that's just a start. I think similar implementations like CBAM are just beyond the corner. And if we want to future-proof organizations, we need to be that step ahead, really thinking about that systems approach. I'm not going to spend too much time on the physical climate change risks, because I believe you guys are all climate experts in the room, and you guys all know what I'm talking about here. It's the most obvious driver of why we need a decarbonization agenda, and climate change risk, physical climate change risks are losses which are resulting from an exposure to severe or more frequent climate change impacts. That includes damage to assets, harm to people, service disruption, supply chain disruption, or loss of productivity. You really can name it. We have it all. The third one, and that's where I want to spend a little bit more time on, is a proxy for efficiency. What do I mean by proxy for efficiency? When we talk about carbon emission reduction or decarbonization efforts, we can actually label that as improving efficiency, and it was also mentioned on the panel a little bit earlier. Less embodied carbon in the end of the day means using less material, using a material with a lower embodied carbon value, quicker construction, smarter construction techniques. In line with the carbon hierarchy, which you see here on the left, and we have our different stages of planning, design, construction, commission, operation, and maintenance, if we take the built environment as an example. Our influence on the carbon value is the highest if we build nothing, if we can actually challenge the need for an asset completely. And that influence to really that ability to influence carbon is really reducing the more we move down that chain. In that instance, we can really use and see the direct correlation between cutting carbon is actually cutting costs. And this is a massive driver for a lot of organizations, not as a sustainability measure, but more as an efficiency driver and as a cost reduction driver. As it was mentioned earlier, in the end of the day, it's all about money. And who doesn't like to save money? So we established the 3 broad demands and drivers categories, so transitional climate change risk, physical climate change risks, and a proxy for efficiency. Now, what does make decarbonization actually successful? The title of the presentation might have given it already away. It's more about targets. It's more about setting a strategy and putting it in a cupboard somewhere, and at 2029 we realize we have 1 year, and then we offset 99% of our carbon emissions. It comes down to three key ingredients: technical, behavioral, and processes and tools. When we look at the technical components, it's all about value engineering. It's about the technologies we use, the materials, the design practices we adopt, and it's about embedding that in our capital delivery process. We know that already. Now, where it stands and where we see really strategy standing and falling is the behavioral aspect, culture and competence. In the past, and I'm pretty sure in the organizations you work, that might be a similar pattern. Sustainability is something which is often in the HSE department somewhere. If you're really lucky, it might be in a strategy department anywhere. But only recently, especially after COP26 in Glasgow, we saw sustainability being actually mentioned on a board level. CFOs are now taking over the sustainability chief officer role. It's because sustainability and carbon needs to be addressed and needs to be cascaded down from a leadership level. If I do have that leadership level support, I can actually challenge carbon decisions across that capital delivery process, have carbon gateways, as we call it. If I challenge carbon at these different gateways, I can also assign ownership to different team members. In the end of the day, we don't need to be all decarbonisation champions. I just need to understand my level of influence I have in a company. What is my role, and how can I influence the decarbonisation agenda of that asset or that project I'm working on? Which also includes training. The last part, and I think that this is something where hopefully I can convince you guys at the end of this presentation, where we have a massive impact, is processes. Decarbonisation is not something where we have this target and we have the 2030 target and we're not really necessarily sure what that 2030 target means for us in the short term, because it's not really embedded in our process. What does that decarbonisation agenda mean for our day-to-day? What is that business as usual scenario? What does that short-term target look like? Is it actually embedded in our investment process? How do we make decisions? Is carbon a deciding factor, or are we only looking about reduction of cost? So we know we need a process. We understand the three key ingredients. Now, what could that process look like? How that process could look like is articulated in Path 2080. And it's the first specification for the built environment to whole life carbon management. Mark McDonald was at the heart of co-authoring that standard 2016 when it first was launched, and we just released an update at the 5th of April last month in the 2023 version. The essence of Path 2080 is about establishing this process we talked about in the earlier slide. For successful decarbonisation, we need to really embed this process in our capital delivery. I just want to mention again the importance of leadership here at the beginning. Without leadership, there is just so much we can do. Leadership really carries the vision and to create that culture of challenge across the capital delivery. Now, I talked a lot theoretical. Let's make some examples. At the beginning, we see here number 8, target setting and baselines. If carbon is really in my culture as an organization, the tender and project staked, we take a built environment example again, really gives me the option to have a joint workshop with my suppliers to really challenge the carbon decisions. What innovation could be applied to drive decarbonisation forward? And thinking about our systems approach, are we actually also on the same page when it comes to climate resilience? What is our resilience approach to that project, to that asset need? So it comes back to that triple bottom line we need to address. Procurement. Number 10, how do we get to our list of suppliers we work with as a company? Do we have an entry criteria? Is it just you need to have an ISO 14001 standard and you have the quality management standard obligation in? Or are there wider targets? Do our suppliers have a decarbonization target? Should a demand be for our suppliers to have a decarbonization target? Once I have my shortlisted suppliers, then I can actually challenge that wider supply chain in my project delivery to provide information which help me as an organization to support monitoring carbon and to make more informed decisions. Understanding the process is great. Let's talk quickly around who needs to be involved. There's again an extract out of the guidance document to PAS 2080. And PAS 2080 is really focused on these 4 value chain members. So you have the asset owner manager, designer, constructor, and the product material suppliers. As you can see already here, these different value chain members are all coming in at different part of the delivery process. That means as an asset owner in the built environment, if I don't have an idea of like what that baseline, the panel also mentioned it before, or it was mentioned, the importance of a baseline on a project level. If we don't understand what a baseline on a project level is, how can I tell my designer what to design to? If the designer doesn't approach it in a low carbon way, how can I ask my contractor to apply low carbon building mechanisms? The chain moves on, and it comes all down to the need of the asset again, where the ability to influence whole life carbon is the greatest. So this is where we obviously see government regulation investment players being in the responsibility to start that conversation. I really want to emphasize that the biggest benefits and the projects I've been involved in the Middle East are really based on collaborative efforts. It's about working together. We need to break out of silos. We need to be more transparent with the specifications we apply and the way we evaluate our suppliers, the contractors, other peers in the industry. So just to summarize, and I hope this is some key takeaways you're taking away today, and something I touched on in the last 20 minutes. First and foremost, what makes decarbonization meaningful? I'm not saying successful because it's meaningful. Decarbonization can be successful in the short term, but we fail to address the triple bottom line later on. What makes decarbonization meaningful is effective leadership, that constant vision throughout the business. We first of all need to ask ourselves, where does sustainability, where does the decarbonization responsibility sit? What is the claim we make as an organization, and who has the responsibility, the accountability in the end? Second part is communication. We talked about it today already. Everyone loves to make net zero claims. Everyone loves to be net zero and carbon neutral. But it's more about that internal communication, which really builds the DNA of a company. How can I drive my employees for a more low carbon behavior? How can I really build that low carbon culture in an organization? Third, metrics and governance. We said targets are not everything, but we need them. What we don't need is only long-term targets, 2030, 2050. What are our baselines on projects? What are our targets on projects? What are our targets for embodied carbon, operational carbon in supplying services? It's about that as an enabler, which really helps us to integrate this into wider decision making, but that's only when I understand the baseline of each project. 4, innovation and standards. I love this about climate change and about the whole service around it. It's constantly evolving. It never stops. So it's about giving the freedoms to challenge rather than just standing still. And we're doing it because we've done it the last 5 or 10 years. and we're doing it because our peer in the industry is doing it. This is really about novel implications for businesses. Fifth, and this is where I would love to see the whole market in the UAE and the Middle East moving towards, is commercial solutions. How can I make carbon as a part for my project awards? How can I drive the carbon as a decision-making factor? How can I incentivize my value chain and my supply chain in more specifics? And sixth, this is a system. So we talked about the different stages, about planning, the design, the construction, the commissioning, the operation. Addressing carbon throughout these key delivery stages is important. But coming back to the systems approach I started this whole presentation with, it's all about really managing to address the triple bottom line. And that is what makes meaningful decarbonization. It's not about thinking in the short term. It's about what are these actions, what are these effects of our actions in the long term. And that's when we actually are part of a sustainable development agenda. Thank you.